This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Dr. Joel Selanikio is an award-winning physician, innovator, and public speaker who leads the efforts of Magpi to develop and promote new technologies and business models for health and international development. This includes the award-winning Magpi mobile data collection and messaging software, the most widely scaled mobile technology ever created for international development, with more than 32,000 users in more than 170 countries. Joel is a frequent keynote speaker and consultant in the fields of social entrepreneurship, innovation, public health, healthcare, and the use of technology for development and emergency and disaster response. He has consulted or spoken on these topics at Davos, TEDx, SciFoo, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Google, DARPA, the Clinton Global Initiative, the Royal Society of Medicine, Fox News, and many other venues. He is a judge for the GSMA Global Mobile Awards and for the Classy Awards for Social Impact, and is a winner of both the $100,000 Lemelson-MIT Award for Sustainability and the Wall Street Journal Technology Innovation Award. Joel is a practicing pediatrician, as well as a former Wall Street computer consultant and former CDC epidemiologist. In his former role as an officer of the Public Health Service, Joel served as Chief of Operations for the Health and Human Services Secretary's Emergency Command Center in the aftermath of 9/11. In 2005, he was given the Haverford Award for Humanitarian Service for his work in treating tsunami victims in Aceh, Indonesia. I spoke with Joel in Washington, D.C. Hi, Joel. Welcome to the Terms of Reference podcast. Thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
Where am I calling you today?
I'm in my home in Washington, D.C.
Well, I hope that the weather is nice up there, that it's not fall yet, right?
No, actually, I think it is quite fall-like in a very nice way. The temperature is mild, low 70s, and yeah, it's beautiful.
Fantastic. Joel, you have had already quite a storied career, technology, medicine, and computer science, many different things. Right now, you're the director, the CEO of a service called Magpi. Let's start by, tell us what Magpi does, what it is, and what it is that you do for that organization right now.
I guess for the majority of people who use Magpi, what it does is it replaces paper forms. And so you can imagine, I'm sure, many situations in your life where you have seen people filling out paper forms or you have filled them out yourself. I actually just went to my doctor recently, and the first thing they did was to hand me a paper form to fill out, I guess, any changes that had happened since a year ago when I last saw my doctor. And those paper forms are really the basis for us learning everything that we know about global health and a lot of things that happen in many countries, and especially poor countries. And because they're paper, and because it's so slow to type them into a computer, and there's lots of inefficiencies, Magpi allows people to very quickly and very, very inexpensively convert from a paper-based form system to an electronic one where you see the forms on mobile phones or tablets rather than on paper.
This is something that thousands of people have tried to do over the last 10, 20 years as technology has become more and more accessible. Is now a time when the stars have aligned and mobile and connectivity have all come together in a way that this is now possible, or is there something that Magpi does that does it better than anybody else?
Well, I think that Magpi does do it better than others, but it's for a whole variety of reasons. We are in a perfect time for this to happen, and we've been in that perfect time for about the last 5 years. And I think the things that have made it perfect include hardware. The fact is that, 10 years ago, most people that you met, especially, for example, Ministry of Health employees or professional people in poor countries 10 or 15 years ago, did not happen to have a supercomputer in their pocket connected to a worldwide network. And now they do. And we're not talking about the majority of the population in poor countries, but certainly the majority of the professional population. Everyone who's got a job basically has now a mobile phone, which is, from the standards of 30 years ago, the most powerful computer that would have existed on the planet back then. And to boot, it's connected to a worldwide and very inexpensive network. So, years ago, when we were doing data collection using unconnected things like Palm Pilots, the big difficulty was actually we had to buy all the Palm Pilots to carry around the world to do data collection. Well, now everyone's got something much better than a Palm Pilot, and they bought it themselves and they've got it in their pocket. So we don't have to buy Palm Pilots and ship them around the world, or buy mobile phones and ship them around the world. It's just enormous, the fact that both the network infrastructure and also this hardware has been made affordable and available all around the world.
That's true. True
Palm Pilots were sold in the United States and in rich countries because they were for, rich business people, but not in poor countries. That's obviously very much not the case for mobile phones.
So what's the biggest barrier for Magpi right now? Most of the people listening to this podcast right now are familiar with NGOs, UN agencies, as you said, ministries that are paper heavy, paper intensive. How do you convince them that this is worth adoption? This is worth the pain of moving away from those systems?
It's often really not painful to move away from those systems. An object in motion tends to stay in motion, and one at rest tends to stay at rest, right? So people tend to keep doing the things that they've always done. I mean, if you put it one way, no one gets fired for doing what they've always done. And typically that's the approach that requires the least energy and the least thought. Well, everybody's busy. They've got families, they've got work, they've got all sorts of things to do. And if I came to you and said, Stephen, I need you to do things in a completely different way, that will be very beneficial for a population of people that doesn't really include you. But from your perspective, Stephen, it's going to take more work and more meetings and more effort. I mean, that's not always an easy sell. And it's not that people say, oh, I don't want to do it because I've got too much stuff on my plate. But the fact is people have a lot of stuff on their plate. But I think for Magpi, it's very interesting. People often ask us, for example, about our competitors in doing this type of mobile data collection. And the fact is, there's I don't know if you've ever read The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen of Harvard, but he talks about non-consumption in his books. And meaning for us, yes, there are organizations or companies that are creating mobile data collection systems that, at least on the surface, are similar to Magpi. But most people aren't using those either. And so it's not as if we have to compete against, the companies making mobile data collection software that seem to be our competitors. Really, what we're competing at is what we're describing, non-consumption. We're competing against people who don't do mobile data collection at all. And sadly, that's the huge majority of people who are collecting data or should be with regard to international development. But to be fair, that's also the case for many, well-funded companies in rich countries. I mean, again, the fact is I showed up at my doctor in Washington, D.C., who's got a very nice office and, I think is making a decent amount of money. And that doctor's office is still using paper forms. So, to say the doctor's office is using paper forms and then to look at some tiny NGO with fewer resources, or for that matter, a large UN organization with lots of resources and say, well, why haven't they led the pack on this? The customer is always right, I guess, in a sense. We have to come up with a Magpi that makes things easier for everyone in that equation if we expect that equation to move forward, if we expect people to use the software. Really, for me, the last 10 years has been learning, one, that equation exists, learning to put myself in the head of all of the different people that need to agree with our software in order to use it, putting ourselves in the seat of the customer and thinking what they think, and then again trying to solve the problem of, okay, if they're not using it, it must be because we're not making things sufficiently easy for them or sufficiently affordable for them. Let's make it cheaper. Let's make it easier. And generally, that approach, I think, has borne fruit. Our users are way up, revenue's up, and I think it's because we're getting better at identifying the problems that are not just our problems, but the users' problems. I think we're also getting better at just, in general, getting our message out there so people know the software exists. That can be an enormous problem, too.
So take me through some of those user problems. One of the best sales tools in the world is a story, right, about how you solved that problem or that aha moment. Do you have any of those that you bring to your users and say, hey, this is how it works?
Well, I mean, to be honest, it's fascinating to me, but we sort of live in two worlds. And this is the case for, I think, anyone who works for or in conjunction with a large organization, whether it's in a poor country or in a rich country. For example, I'm on staff at a hospital here in Washington, D.C. In my personal life, I've got an iPhone, I've got a nice tablet, a great laptop. The software that I use is generally a dream. It's fantastic. My experience in my personal software over the last 10 years has been that it has gotten every year cheaper to the point when most of it now is free. The hardware gets better and better and better. The network gets faster. Everything's bliss. Okay, now let's look at the software that we use in our large institutions, whether that's the government or whether it's a UN agency or whether it's a big corporation. I mean, the fact is generally the software in those institutions, by any measure compared with our personal technology, sucks. completely. So you would not believe how bad the electronic medical record system is that I am forced to use when I'm at the hospital.
Well, I'm thinking of the one that I see most often is the airline industry.
Well, and hey, look, at least it works, right? I mean, the reservation system generally works. Most of the time, they don't lose your reservations, right? I mean, you could definitely say the reservation system for the airlines is much better than people trying to do the same thing on paper. As clunky as it is, you cannot, I do not think, say that about most electronic medical record systems. Theoretically, of course, they're better than paper. But in practice, I think they're actually worse in many, many respects. So the thing is, as I said, for us, looking over the last 10 years, part of it has been when we approach customers, they are embedded in many times in these organizations, and they're used to, for example, thinking, let's see, I'm at home and I want an application that's going to show me soccer scores. Okay, I assume, of course, that it's a couple taps away, and I assume it's going to be free, and it'll take me 5 minutes to get it. I also assume I will not require any consultants to install it or teach me how to use it, right? Well, I mean, sound familiar, right?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Okay, now, can you imagine anyone in any institution saying, okay, I think we're going to get some software for our institution, so I assume, of course, I can look it up online, get it going immediately, won't require training, and it's not going to cost anything. So there is this huge disconnect between the ways that software is provided to institutions and the ways that software is provided to individuals.
Take me down the security path there. Then that's one of the first places that the institutional brain goes to. Must make this data secure. I must control access. I have to know how it works in order to be able to protect my data and protect my users.
You mean, what do the IT people in the institution think, or do you mean what do the actual regular workers within an institution think? I think the IT people in an institution are generally trying to do the safest thing, and it's sort of the same as if you talk to the legal staff in any institution. The safest thing is always to do nothing, to change nothing. Mm-hmm. And of course, I think anyone who's ever been in the situation of having people explain to you that it's not safe to make any change, you have to point out to them that doing nothing, typically, at least, conflicts with the mission of the organization, which usually is to do something. And so you say to the lawyer and you say to the IT person, yes, we do understand that not doing anything would be technically the safest thing, but now can you please show us how we can do something like our mission and minimize at least the threats, both legal and in terms of IT. I think when we talk to people, sometimes they have issues about security. When we talk to people in a large institution, they have issues about security. But that's not really the biggest obstacle. The really biggest obstacle is explaining to them that software for them to do, for example, mobile data collection can be exactly as easy and just as inexpensive as their personal software. Mm-hmm. And usually when I explain that divide, that dichotomy I just described, even though we're all living in this, we are swimming in this world in which that divide is a very real thing. I find that 9 out of 10 times, it's the very first time it has occurred to them that there is this grave distinction between their personal software and the way they get it and what they pay for it and how they learn to use it and their professional software.
So what's the next move for Magpi, and what's the next 2 or 3 years look like? Is it, other than the standard answer of continuing to refine the service and grow the user base, is there an innovation you're looking at? Is there a technology you're waiting for? Is there something you're developing that you think is going to be yet another game changer?
With this, we already talked a little bit about this, profusion of mobile phones all around the world. Right now, I'm old enough to remember when the profusion was the profusion of personal computers. Right, so back in the late 80s, I was working on Wall Street. I was working for a bank. That was when personal computers started appearing on people's desktops in the bank. The internet effectively didn't exist. We certainly didn't use it for very much. And usually when those computers appeared on people's desks, they had just a few pieces of software on them. Typically a spreadsheet program and a word processor, right? Maybe a calendar and a calculator. Of course, what that meant was at that time, and in, let's say 1989, if you compare the software that was on those computers with the software that you now use every day, the applications that you really feel are essential to your doing everything you want to do, none of that stuff existed except for the spreadsheet and the word processor and the calendar and the calculator. Well, for the mobile phone, this new platform that is much more ubiquitous than the personal computer is ever going to wind up being. For the mobile phone, we are in 1989, right? We have all these mobile phones all around the world, right? Shepherds have mobile phones. village chiefs have mobile phones. And generally what those mobile phones have on them are two applications, voice and SMS. Now, as I alluded to before, these mobile phones, and I mean the simplest of these mobile phones, is orders of magnitude more powerful than the computers that the US military had back in the 70s. And yet, generally, we think of them as being not very functional. And so we're in the situation, as I said, like we were back in 1989, where essentially there is a world of software that could be built to run not just on smartphones, but even on these so-called dumb phones. And none of that software has been invented yet, except for two applications, voice and SMS. That's basically, for most people that have these cheap phones in poor countries, that's mostly it. So when you ask me, what do I think we're going to do next? What else can be done? I think the sky's the limit. You could start out by, for example, thinking about what did I do for the past week on my laptop every day or on my tablet, and trying to think of a way to extend some of the functionality of whatever it was I was doing down to someone who has a basic phone. I mean, that would last you through several careers. Scheduling, buying and selling things, etc. And of course, people are trying to come up with these apps. For Magpi in particular, I think we've managed to combine, if you will, the technology model of Facebook and Gmail, where essentially you go to a website, you register, and you're up and running. No training required, certainly no formal training required. The basic version is free, right? Just like using Google Maps. And we've managed to combine that with the business model of Skype, whereby because we're doing this on the internet and the costs are so low, like Skype, we can afford to give away most of our product. Roughly 60% of Skype users just use the free version, as you and I are doing right now. And then the other users pay to do computer to phone calls. But the rates are very reasonable, so no one has a problem with that. Likewise, we have a similar business model. The vast majority of our users use the free version, and some of them pay, and that supports the whole enterprise. So we've been the first, and are still, I'm struggling here, but we're among certainly the only organizations that are trying to address international development or global health issues that has done this, that has said, we're going to adopt a new business model, we're going to adopt a new technology model. And we've done it to address issues of how do we get people to collect data better. But there are many, many other things that people need to do with computers, both within the international development and global health, and also in lots of other things. And very few people are actually making headway in making those things available. So to give you just one example, mobile messaging. Now, at this point, as a physician, I've read, probably in the last 2 years, I've probably read 5 or 6 journal articles in medical journals or international development journals talking about pilot projects where somebody sent text messages to some population to achieve some kind of benefit. For example, they sent text messages to pregnant women to remind them to show up at their prenatal visits. And typically these are phrased as pilots or studies in which they have a research question, and that question, somewhat unbelievably, is, if we remind people to do something, are they more likely to do it? And unremarkably, the answer turns out always to be yes. The problem with this approach is that it's just pilot after pilot after pilot after pilot. The international development community, in many ways, is set up to just do pilots. That's the most lucrative thing to do. Build a pilot, write a paper, let it crash, get a grant, build a pilot, write a paper, let it crash, and move on to the next one. We don't want to do that. We don't want to write a paper about how theoretically it's good to send messages to pregnant women so that they attend their prenatal visits so their babies are born healthier. We want to make a system so that every pregnant woman gets those messages, so that every health system can afford to send those messages. And the problem is that the pilots typically, because it always winds up flying international consultants from place to place, cost $100,000 or $200,000 per pilot. Well, little clinics in poor countries cannot afford $200,000 per clinic. And so getting back to what we're going to do next, earlier this year, we introduced messaging capabilities in Magpi to, for example, allow people to send timed messages that are timed to things like pregnancy due dates or appointment dates, and to do so very, very inexpensively, both with SMS and even with voice, so that the messages go out, you can choose, does it go out as a text message, obviously only useful for a literate population, or does it go out as a phone call where someone just picks up the phone and it says, in whatever language you want, hey, don't forget to go to your clinic appointment on Friday, right? Again, innovation isn't sort of coming up with something that's good enough to do a pilot with. Innovation means coming up with the business model, the sustainability model. That means you can afford to scale it and people can afford to use it. So we have this approach, which is almost unique, if not unique within international development, of this Gmail plus Skype tech plus business model. And I think there's a million things we can think of examples of technology that is useful, but essentially unused, like sending timed text messages. And we're going to apply the Magpi model to those things and make them not just possible at $200,000 a pop, but doable and affordable for everybody's budget.
And so what's the limitation, do you think, for these other types of applications showing up? Is it simply the innovative power? And I'm thinking specifically, where did Magpi come from as far as its seed funding? It's before you were had a sustainable revenue base. Where did that come from, and where did the foundation and the support come from to do this? Was it your back pocket? Was it somewhere else?
No. I mean, so that's a great question. So we were originally, we're about 10 years old now. We were originally entirely grant supported. I came out of the U.S. government. I used to be a CDC employee, and my business partner and co-founder of Datadyne, Rose Donna, came out of the American Red Cross. When we decided we might be able to do something on our own that we weren't able to do within our respective institutions, we weren't thinking about running businesses or social businesses or anything like that. None of us had any experience in business. We thought, okay, we're going to need money to make some cool technology and give it away to people. I guess we should apply for grants.
Before you go further, what was the aha moment there for you? And I apologize, their co-founder of Datadyne, to make the jump from CDC and American Red Cross to say, this is something that we're going to make the jump, we're going to go do this? What was that moment?
I don't think it was a moment. I think it's something that it was a realization that developed over years. And this is no slight at all to either the American Red Cross or CDC, both of which are great institutions that there are things that they do exceptionally well. I think technology innovation is not one of those things. And I think, honestly, it was really a tribute to my own density that I was trying to do technology innovation at CDC for many years, and shockingly found out that the organization wasn't really with me on that. But the thing is, it's not the mission of CDC to do tech innovation. Responding to outbreaks, absolutely, everyone's on board, right? Developing recommendations for flu vaccines, absolutely, that's on board. And so many, many other super important things that CDC does. But at a certain point of basically trying to do something that the organization wasn't made to do, and similarly with Rose, we just sort of realized at the time, and I think at the time I thought, gosh, I can't believe CDC doesn't let me do this tech innovation stuff. What I should have been thinking is, Joel, what on earth, that's like saying walking into a restaurant and deciding you want to exercise. Right. The restaurant's not there for you to exercise. Sure. And if the maitre d' seems miffed that you want to exercise, or in fact are exercising, don't be mad at the maitre d'. Realize where you are. Right. It's not the right place.
And so grant funding started Datadyne, which is, for our listeners, it has evolved into Magpi.
Right.
At what point, or are you still, mostly grant funded, or are you?
We're not grant funded at all.
Congratulations.
We don't have any grants. So, what happened was that over the course of time, and, we received, I should say the names of our grant funders to whom we are eternally grateful, including the World Bank, especially the United Nations Foundation and the Vodafone Foundation, also the Knight Foundation. And these guys gave us money to do particular things, and essentially that wound up being our seed funding. The problem was, at a certain point, I started, I'm reaching back now about 5 years, and I started, because we were doing technology, but we were doing it in poorer countries, like in sub-Saharan African countries, et cetera. I started getting invited to Silicon Valley events, technology conferences at Google, et cetera, because almost as the novelty act, right? It was sort of like, isn't this kind of funny or cool or cute? Look at this guy. He's kind of a doctor, but he's doing technology, but he's doing it in Africa. I don't think anybody at those places learned anything about technology from me. They might have learned something about poor countries or about health stuff, but I learned an enormous amount. I learned a way of thinking about what in international development we call sustainability, and in Silicon Valley they call profitability. And I learned different approaches to that, things I had never heard before. And I learned it from people who were doing exactly what I thought I was doing, which is running a software company, right? I learned, wow, guess what? There's all these different ways to run software companies successfully. And none of them involve having to apply for grants every year.
Mm-hmm.
And more than that, we sort of started to notice that some of the downsides of getting grant funding. And, for example, with a grant funder, generally, you get a grant, some big institution gives you a grant. They're not users of your software, right? Meaning your customer, the people who are paying you, is such and such a foundation. And your user is somebody different. Let's say a Ministry of Health worker in Cambodia. Just right from the get-go, that's a bad situation, right? You don't want all your users to not be customers, to not be paying you money, right? Because the thing is, you pay the most attention to the people who are paying you the money. Well, when you pay the most attention, or almost all your attention, to people who are well-meaning, who are giving you grants, but who are not users of your software and who know very, very little about the end use of the software, it means you're spending a lot of time paying attention to well-meaning people that really can't, through no fault of their own, they cannot help you make the software better.
Mm-hmm.
Now think about a situation where you're buying software from a software company, the sort of the usual kind of situation, right? I mean, the fact is that software company, it's existential. They must please you, the customer, who is the user. If you're not happy with, let's say some scheduling software, or for that matter, your mobile carrier, or a particular, spreadsheet program, or, mobile app, you switch to another one, right? So they have to please you, the people who are actually doing the work on the ground. I decided after this kind of Silicon Valley inoculation and some thought that all in all, though we appreciated that grant funding, it would be better for us to move to a model in which we were getting at least some of our money from the people who were actually using the software. And then we basically decided to enact that. So we went from grant funded and giving the software away to everyone to zero grants and tiered pricing. Free version, where we kind of aimed at trying to figure out a good free version that would work for about 90% of our users. And then a couple tiers of more advanced versions or more feature-filled versions above that. And we did that about, I guess it's coming up on 5 years ago. We went from whatever we were making in hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of grant revenue to zero revenue, which I don't recommend to people. And, and then basically ever since then, it's been, we hit that bottom, and then ever since then, every year revenue goes up. So we're at a situation, we were at a situation immediately in which we weren't getting any grants, but we weren't paying our bills, right? We weren't able to bring in enough revenue to pay our bills. Now we more than pay our bills, and 100% of the money that we get is from the people who use our software, which is, again, is quite unusual, if not unique, within folks who are doing so-called, technology for development or technology for good. And again, it's just really by emulating Silicon Valley approaches. I think one of the reasons that this is unusual in international development or in global health is that the organizations that typically provide technology within global health, and have done so for decades now, they have a business model where they make money by consulting, right? Boots on the ground, lots of training. If you make money by doing consulting, right, and you are making a lot of money, you've got very, very nice offices, maybe in several different cities, and beautiful furniture and fantastic benefits, right? You've got a lot of overhead. Well, if you have a lot of overhead, you are not in a position to say, hey, let's switch to a more scalable, but much less profitable model. Now, of course, it'll mean we're going to have to close a couple of our offices and lay off a lot of our staff and cut our benefits, but let's do that because it's going to be better for world peace, right? Those organizations can't do that. Once you are hooked into that very lucrative consulting model, which is perfectly appropriate for many things, just not for this kind of technology, but you can't change it. It's like me I've got a mortgage here in DC. I can't say, hey, I think I'm going to switch to a job that pays me nothing. Mm-hmm. Or I'm going to actually more realistically say, I think I'm going to switch to a job that pays me 20% of what I'm making now. I don't have that option. I can't do it. And they don't have that option either. And so the traditional players within technology and international development continue to pump out pilots and projects and consultant-based technology. And I think what's really the salvation is either organizations like us that may manage to make the switch to a new model, a different business model that's more affordable and more scalable. Or I see this increasingly, I think Silicon Valley companies, just regular old technology companies, software companies, are beginning to look at the international development sector, and probably more importantly, beginning to look at developing countries in general, and the population's there, and the businesses there, and the hospitals there, and say, oh, these people are actually not just targets for our humanitarian action, right? They're not just beneficiaries. These are potential customers.
True social enterprise thought, basically.
Exactly. Well, I mean, not for social enterprise purposes. I think
no,
just
but I mean,
for enterprise purposes.
Right, exactly. But it's enterprise purposes. But what I think the world still recognizes is we still, in my opinion, have this distinction between, hey, this is a for-profit entity, this is a social enterprise, this is a not-for-profit. When what maybe you see this as well, but those three worlds, in my mind, have already come together, and it's really about how are you serving the population, full stop.
I totally agree, but that's why I think the distinction between social enterprise and enterprise is not a useful distinction to make, because it seems to me that most of the time when I'm talking to people who are at social enterprises or people who are fans of social enterprises, what they're saying is, the reason we're a social enterprise is because of what's in my heart, Joel. Let me explain to you what my motivations are in my heart. And I have generally found that the best indication of what's in people's hearts is what they actually do and accomplish, not what they tell me they are feeling. Mm-hmm. So whether you say that you are a social enterprise, I mean, if you say, I know many organizations, they tell me they're social enterprises, but they're still locked in this consultant-based thing. Again, lucrative, but completely unscalable. So again, I take everyone what they say at face value, but I need to, as I can't remember who said this, maybe it was Reagan who said, trust but verify, right? What I want to see is results. And so, I think the standout example of all this, of course, in our lifetimes is the mobile phone. This is not a charity project or a social enterprise. This is the result of, apparently rapacious capitalistic companies working only to make money. And yet anyone who works in international development or global health, I think, acknowledges that the mobile phone is either the most significant beneficial development for poor populations in poor countries, not to mention us, of our lifetimes, or it's certainly in the top three, right? And again, this is the thing that has had by far the most social benefit to any poor person on earth, and it is not in any way a social enterprise. So we have a choice between either social enterprises that are pure of heart but don't seem to get anything done, or just regular old enterprises that do get stuff done. Mm-hmm. Again, it doesn't seem to me like the distinction is important. The important thing is, are you getting stuff done?
Let's spend a few minutes. You recently wrote a chapter in a book called The Rise of the Reluctant Innovator. Even in our 20 minutes together here so far, you've talked about being a physician, being a banker, being the head of a technology company. How did you stumble into this world of international aid and delivering a technology solution that obviously you're focused on global health, you're focused on that particular facet of where Magpi can go? I'm sure you have other clients that use it in other places as well. But how did you get here? What was that path?
Boy, well, first of all, I should say I was never a banker. I was working in technology at a bank. So,
okay.
Yeah, I mean, my suits would have been several cuts below the actual bankers within the bank. But I think when I got out of my pediatric residency, I began working at CDC, first in outbreak investigation and in other things. But because of what I'd done at the bank, I had maybe I always had a kind of technology bent. I had some experience from working at the bank. And at the time when I was starting to work for CDC, we started to get mobile computing occurring. And so it, somehow, when I was sent out in the field to be the person collecting data on all these paper forms, and probably even more importantly, when I was the person who had to type the data from, at the end of a very long, hot day, type the data from those paper forms into a computer so that I could do the analysis, it occurred to me, I wonder if we can use these newfangled, PDAs to do this faster. And I think a lot of people had that idea at the time, or at least several people had that idea at the time. The people that I've talked to, including in conjunction with Ken Banks, who edited that book about reluctant innovation, and who I was just talking to him this morning, the people I've talked to, it strikes me that they see something that makes sense to them that would make things better in some way, and they can't let it go. They just can't let it go. Like they think of it at odd moments. They can't put it down. They can't let it go. And I that's sort of how I feel it was for me. CDC had me doing a variety of different things. I kept trying to bring it back to doing that. And eventually I left so that I could work on that. Because as we said, I was trying to exercise in the restaurant, right? But really, to me, it's just for some reason, I guess, people see something, they feel that they can improve it, and they can't stop until they do. I remember thinking, 10 years ago, when I was considering leaving my government job, I mean, nowadays it seems like a no-brainer to do data collection electronically rather than on paper, although most organizations still don't do it. But at the time, I remember thinking I was so sure it was a good idea, even though it was, essentially non-existent at the time, or almost. And I remember thinking, what if this is the only great idea I ever have? Right? I mean, basically, I could stay with the security of my current job. Am I going to be able to live the rest of my life thinking that I had what I firmly believed, and I still believe looking back, was a great idea, and I didn't act on it or try to find out if that was true? And I just determined at the time, and I've heard sort of similar things from other folks who've done things like this, that you have to know, you have to find out. Am I right? Is this a great idea? Will this make a difference? Is this going to create some kind of positive change? And you can't put it down.
And so how did that lead you to, I guess that you're saying that your work at the CDC was in the field, you were entering the data, and that, do you believe that you were already in the aid and development world at that point, or has that you now have become an advocate for that particular label now?
Oh, I see. No. I mean, at the time, CDC does global health work.
Sure.
Global health is often thought of as being, it's arguable, but it's often thought of as being kind of a subset of international development work. And so, yeah, I was in the thick of things. I mean, I was, doing malaria stuff and doing developing country health work for CDC, collecting data on paper, typing it into computers, doing the analysis. And that just struck me with my technology background as such an absurdly inefficient way to do things. I mean, imagine if you walked into any Fortune 500 company nowadays and you walked past the accounting department and noticed that there were no computers and everyone was using paper spreadsheets. I mean, imagine if you saw that.
I'm trying to imagine that right now.
Right. I mean, you if that company was not, I mean, first of all, you would know that company nowadays would not be a profitable company, right? So you'd know they'd be on their last legs, but you would think, maybe I can't fix the whole company, but I bet you if we move to doing computer-based accounting, I bet you it's going to improve the results for this company. Well, in international development, I mean, at this point, I've been pushing this for quite a long time, and I don't kid myself. I bet 95% of the field data that's collected is still collected on paper.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was doing it, I just said, there's got to be a better way. And again, I have spent 10 years working with Rose and working with my colleagues at Datadyne, now Magpi, trying to figure out what are the stumbling blocks, what are the resistance points, how do we get people to adopt this, and making steady those slow progress.
How is it that you divide your time usually? You said you're assistant professor at pediatrics over at Georgetown right now. You are the head of Magpi. You're a board member for Frontline SMS. What's a typical day look like for you, if there is one?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's very interesting because when you're a doctor, if you're a doctor and you're something else, people, because being a doctor, everyone feels like they know what that means and they know what you do. And so everyone always assumes that the doctor's the full-time thing and whatever else is the part-time thing. Here, it's quite the reverse. So Datadyne's been my full-time job now Magpi, we just changed the name, has been my full-time job for 10 plus years now. At Georgetown, I'm an assistant professor of pediatrics. I see patients in a clinic about 4 hours a week, and the other roughly 160 hours in the week that I work is all working on Magpi activities. Of course, as you mentioned, I'm on the board of Frontline, and that's usually a commitment of some hours per year, but certainly not on a weekly basis. So the average week for me, I mean, we could be dealing with everything from business development issues, that is talking with new folks who are going to be using Magpi, talking with our tech team, who's based in Nairobi, a fantastic team, both for tech support and also for our programmers. Just a great group of people. I just got back from Nairobi, and I just can't tell you what a pleasure it is to work with our team, because everybody is super competent. Everybody is respectful of everyone else's competencies, and we get things done. So, a good part of my week, usually about 3 times a week, I have Skype calls with our Nairobi team. Sometimes the topic of those calls will be kind of our product roadmap and where we're moving in terms of our next steps and features we're adding. Sometimes it's reviewing what are recent tech support requests. What are things people are having a problem with? And if people are consistently having a problem with something, how do we solve that? That is to say, is this a bug that needs to be fixed? Is it a bad design on our part that needs to be corrected? Is it something that could be made simpler to the user through better design or perhaps through better support materials or training? This, again, it's interesting because even the excellence we try to achieve in terms of customer support gets back to our business model again. And what I mean by this, I heard Jeff Bezos speak, and he said he felt that every time someone at Amazon, anytime an Amazon customer had to speak to a human representative at Amazon, he considered that to be a massive system failure. Right? Now, we all know that Jeff Bezos, whatever else he is certainly not against the idea of good customer support. Most of us who've purchased something from Amazon have gotten great, it's been a very painless, easy, even enjoyable process. But what, of course, he means is that it's not scalable for them to have every single one of their millions of customers talking on the phone with a person. They have to make it so that everything goes smoothly, and the vast majority of customers never even think about needing to use customer support. And likewise with us. We provide more mobile data collection services in international development than probably all of the other providers combined. 33,000 users, I think, as of this week. If we were to have all of those users requiring training or tech support, we could never provide that, right? I mean, we would never be able to work our way through that list. And so we have to design a system that means that most people get exactly what they want without the need to ask for customer support or training.
One of the questions I love to ask on these podcasts, and I ask it to everyone, over the last 10 years, it seems like it's been a gradual growth and gradual success one after another. You were just describing how a good portion of your time is looking at bugs, looking at things that need to change. When's the last time that you had a significant failure, either in the software or providing the service for a user or a base of users? And what did you do about that? How'd you sort of turn that around and learn from it or create a success out of it?
I mean, to me, the one that really sticks out is about 2 years ago. That was when the software was still called, I'm trying to think if that was when it was called EpiSurveyor or we'd already changed the name to Magpi. But we put in place a new system for basically putting logic into a form. The kind of thing where if they answer this, then jump to that.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And, effectively, we didn't test it enough. And so we began having lots of users get back to us and say they were having trouble with that logic. I mean, this was entirely our fault and not the user's fault. But I can tell you, and again, this gets to the issue of where your funding comes from. The thing is, if we don't have users, then we don't have paying users. If we don't have paying users, then we all have to go get another job. I remember going through a period of a couple months where every morning I'd wake up, roll over in bed, pick up my phone, and open my email, dreading to do so, knowing that there were going to be 10 or 15 or 20 customer support requests, because at the time I was routing all the customer support requests so I could at least see them. And do you know what it's like to wake up in the morning with 20 people, 20 angry people complaining about, your life's work? Mm-hmm. People who, in many cases, were trying to do something in the field that had been planned for months and were running into a problem because of a mistake that we made.
And in today's age, those 20 people have just told their 20 friends or their 200 friends on Facebook, right?
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, at the time, you don't even think that way. You just think, every one of those users that you have disappointed, you've failed them. You have this relationship with them where, it's quite clear. We have said, we're going to help you do this, and we have failed to do it. I can tell you that is very hard. It is emotionally hard. It's psychologically very difficult. It's depressing. Obviously, it's not to our credit that we let the mistake happen in the first place. I think the only thing to our credit is that we didn't crumble or dissolve into a bundle of tears, but we mobilized, identified the problem, worked to fix the problem in the fastest possible way. And in many cases, did everything that we possibly could to make it right with the customers and the users that were out there. But again, this gets back to this issue of the business model, because this was not only a question where we felt like we had done something against the trust of our users, which would be bad enough, but added to that, this was an existential threat for us. If we had been grant supported, it would have been the first one, but it wouldn't have been the second one, right? Mm-hmm. There would have been no risk to our existence as an organization because our funding wouldn't have depended on how well the software did its job.
The last question I always ask every terms of reference guest here, deals with helping others achieve what you've achieved or take that leap into international development or humanitarian aid work. Is there a critical piece of advice or something that you counsel others on when they're either considering making a transition, making a jump like you did from a nice stable CDC job to an innovation like this, or just somebody coming out of a master's degree who wants to get that first job, about how to make it happen and what you look for when you're looking to hire someone?
Well, so that's a lot of different questions, right? We're a small team, and we don't often need to hire. Our last hires have all been technological ones, right? Programmers, et cetera. Although we obviously we do from time to time increase our staff. But in terms of giving people advice for whether they should leave their jobs, give up a comfortable position to risk something else, I'm not sure if advice is what sort of makes that happen. Again, I think you've either got that thing burning inside of you that won't let you not do it, or you don't. When I was considering that, I just couldn't sleep. I just felt like, again, this is a great idea. What if I don't do it? What if am I just going to say, okay, I'll just show up at the office every day and go through my office job and not get stuff done, not get this thing done that I think could really be a game changer? Again, that either really affects you or it doesn't. And I should also say that, for me, though it was a very significant decision, seemed like a big decision at the time, felt very risky, for example. But I also have to say, realistically, as a licensed physician, I'm very wary of advocating that other people quit their comfortable, safe, secure jobs. Because for me, obviously, the worst case scenario is I go and I work as a doctor someplace in a hospital, which is hardly a worst case scenario. Mm-hmm. For other folks who don't have that kind of ace in the hole, there could be much more significant impact if they were to give up their security and basically fail to do what it was they wanted to do. So I know that information, of course, it's not going to make any difference to the people out there who really have the fire in their belly that want to make this happen, because nothing I say is going to be able to stop them or make them go. We can offer encouragement, but we certainly wouldn't be able to stop them through the simple, simply giving common sense advice. People like that are going to do it whether or not anybody thinks it's a good idea or not.
You're an inspiration for other people. Who do you look to for inspiration, or who are you watching right now as innovators that you say, wow, I think they've got something?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, it's not just innovators. I think the people that I pay attention to, the people that I watch, are, first of all, technology people. I think the stuff that's happening out of Silicon Valley, though sometimes, everybody complains that some of the stuff is trivial, but let's face it, they're transforming our lives in lots of really important ways. The internet, we're really only starting to get the impact now, only starting to have the slightest idea of the impact of mobile and the internet and how that changes things for people. Having a really ubiquitous worldwide network of computers in people's pockets. So I pay a lot of attention to what happens in Silicon Valley. Not social enterprise in Silicon Valley, just businesses in Silicon Valley. Along the same lines, I'm a huge fan of the fellow I mentioned before, Clay Christensen at Harvard, whose book, The Innovator's Dilemma, really, when I read it, laid off a roadmap for us in terms of how to proceed technologically and in terms of business model. That book is about how disruptive innovations, disruptive technologies included, how they're able to succeed. And honestly, when I read that book, I thought, oh my God, this book is about us. So incredibly, incredibly useful. So just about everything that Clayton Christensen writes, I read. And then there's folks, I guess, closer to home. Folks within global health, organizations that are doing great work. I'm constantly trying to pay attention to what they're doing because they are our end user, either currently or potentially. And our whole job is to try and figure out a way to let them do their work in better ways and faster ways and less expensive ways and more scalable ways, many times in ways that they themselves are not in a position to picture or imagine, paying attention to them. There's not too many folks who work within the technology for development field, to be perfectly frank, that I take a lot from, because most of them are working on, the kind of the model of how can we get more grants to do what we do? And we're not interested in that. Many of them are doing good work, and I think that's great, but it's just not the approach that we're taking, so it's not very useful for us to learn from them. I would say that certainly we've talked about Ken Banks, reluctant innovator, editor, and the founder of Frontline SMS. I mean, Ken is someone that I have not frequent enough, but certainly frequent conversations with, and I always find to be a great sounding board and an innovation kind of leader that, is a great person to talk to about this. So I would certainly count Ken as being among the influences. Yeah, I mean, that's about it. I pay tons of attention to, technology, especially mobile technology, internet. Clay Christensen, who's kind of, a heading of his own. And and a couple people within international development and our customers.
Joel, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it.
No, it's been great. I really appreciate it, Stephen.